Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ed Wright, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the discussion of the Iran nuclear deal, compromise or catastrophe, a discussion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action entered into between the United States, several other countries, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Joining me tonight as moderator is Dean Joaquin Ruiz, and it's our pleasure to welcome you, and we want to welcome all of those who are joining us at satellite places across this campus and that are joining us via live stream courtesy of Arizona Public Media. We want to thank AZPM and Jack Gibson for their support of this event. It is an event that grew out of a discussion between Dean Ruiz, myself, and Dean J.P. Jones of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Over dinner, we were discussing the agreement. And I'll be honest, we were sitting back and forth boasting about the experts in our colleges. And rather than just having one person give a talk and having question and answer, we thought about the best way to showcase the strengths of the university, the strengths of our college, is to do a panel discussion where you would have experts in 3 different areas approach the same topic and explore it in a circumspect way. So it's my pleasure to welcome you. Dean Jones is unable to be with us tonight, but he sends his warm greetings. And this collaborative interdisciplinary endeavor is something that we want to do more of to promote understanding in our community around the country. There are people joining us, as we've heard already, from literally around the country. And it's an honor to have you join us tonight. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dean Joaquin Ruiz, who will introduce our panelists, and we'll get started.
Thank you very much. The idea, of course, is that the treaty not only is a technical treaty, but it also has significant consequences beyond the technicalities of the treaty. And when I'm now recounting the conversation we had, and I think it was beer, it wasn't dinner. The conversation we had, we pointed out that we should try to separate those things so that the whole conversation is not a mush, but that we can actually describe what's been written, both in its technical characteristics as well as its social and economic and political implications. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Phil Pinto, right here to my left, is professor of astronomy and physics. He studies the largest nuclear explosions in the universe, the good kind though, the kinds that make stars and the kinds that makes all kinds of the elements that we're made out of. He has also done work on nuclear non-proliferation issues and has worked as a consultant for the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, one of the United States nuclear weapons labs, for more than 20 years, doing both celestial and laboratory astrophysics. Phil has published over 120 papers on the physics of stellar explosions, high energy density plasmas in the laboratory, techniques for computer modeling in astrophysics, and you can say bombs, and most recently in the formation of large-scale structure of the universe. To his left is Faten Ghosh, an associate professor of government and public health policy. She received her BA and MA from the American University in Beirut and her PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. Her research and teaching interests focus on the interaction of adversaries, be they conflictual or cooperative. In particular, she has been interested in how such actors handle their disagreements. A common theme running throughout her interests is the importance of the choice of strategy that is picked by the adversaries to manage their conflicts and how such strategies and policies are implemented, particularly in the post-conflict setting. Her articles have appeared in the British Journal of Political Science, Conflict Management and Peace Science, International Journal of Human Rights, International Negotiation, International Studies Quarterly, as well as Middle East Journal. And to her left is Asher Susser, is a Stein Professor of Modern Israel Studies in the Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Arizona. He's also Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History and the Stanley and Eileen Gold Senior Fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University. He was the director of the center for 12 years and taught for over 30 years in Tel Aviv's Department of Middle Eastern History. He has been a Fulbright Fellow and a visiting professor at Cornell University, the University of Chicago, and Brandeis University. An internationally acclaimed scholar, Asher is the author or editor of scores of scholarly articles and many important books on Middle East politics. We're lucky to have the 3 of you here. Thank you so much. The way it's going to work is I think each one of you will give an opening statement, about 5 minutes, on what you feel is important from your vantage point on the issue, and then there'll be some questions following that. Phil?
All right, well, welcome. Since 1968, 191 countries have signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. And the idea expressed in the NPT is that it's possible for a country to have peaceful nuclear power and at the same time for other countries to be able to detect, if not avert, a breakout from that peaceful nuclear power to military uses before those military uses actually come to pass. And in fact, the NPT guarantees, and I quote, that the inalienable right of all the parties to the treaty to develop research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. Now, since the revolution in '79, Iran has not always lived up to its commitments under the NPT, and today Iran is what the arms control community would call a nuclear threshold state, a country with the ability to produce a nuclear weapon relatively quickly, but which has not done so yet. Now, it's important to recognize that the International Program of Non-Proliferation Safeguards, as embodied in the NPT, is not about denying nuclear weapons to nations. It's about buying time to find other solutions. In the present context, it's about buying time to convince a threshold state that the benefits of remaining nuclear-free outweigh any benefits of acquiring nuclear weapons. So a country is likely to pursue the production of one of two isotopes when making its first nuclear weapon, uranium-235 and plutonium-239. Uranium occurs naturally, but uranium-235 is only 0.7% of natural uranium. Almost all the rest is uranium-238, which interferes with the chain reactions that you need in a reactor or a bomb. And so to get around the problem of that interference, most commercial reactors use uranium in which the concentration of uranium-235 has been enriched to between 3 and 5%. But to build a bomb, you have to enrich the uranium to U-235 content of more than 80%. And today this enrichment is usually done with a device called a gas centrifuge, but each gas centrifuge only produces a very small enrichment. And so you need to link thousands of them together to get a practical enrichment capability. And so producing even a very small amount of enriched uranium implies building a large facility that uses a lot of electric power, and experience has shown they're pretty hard to hide. Now, uranium enrichment poses 3 proliferation problems. First, the same centrifuges can be arranged to produce either low enrichment reactor fuel or high enrichment bomb material. And so having the capability to make low enrichment reactor fuel necessarily means that you have the capability to create bomb-grade material. Second, a commercial power reactor requires tons of low enriched uranium for operation every year. Well, a country's first bomb can require as little as 15 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. So this means that diverting even a very small fraction of an enrichment plant's capability can easily produce enough material for a bomb in a relatively short time. And third, once you've made enough low enriched uranium for reactors, you've actually done most of the work in getting it all the way to high enriched uranium. So having a stockpile of low enriched uranium fuel lying around means you've actually got a really strong head start if you wanted to make high enrichment fuel starting from that material. The other element a nation can pursue to make a bomb is plutonium. One needs even less plutonium to make a bomb, about 7 kilograms. That's about the size of an orange. Plutonium doesn't occur naturally. It must be made, and it's made by irradiating uranium-238 in a nuclear reactor and then chemically separating the plutonium from the other elements of the spent fuel. And so how does the agreement with Iran deal with these issues? It puts limits on the number and types of centrifuges Iran may have for the next 15 years. Iran will have to remove 13,000 currently operating centrifuges. One of its 2 enrichment facilities at Fordo will be converted to a research establishment which will do no uranium enrichment. The other at Natanz will be limited to operating only 5,060 devices and to making at most 3 2/3% enriched uranium, low enrichment. The agreement provides for monitoring, inspections, and accounting of the entire nuclear fuel chain from mines through centrifuges to spent nuclear fuel. The total inventory of low enriched uranium in Iran will be reduced from 12,000 kilograms to 300 kilograms. That's about 1/6 of the amount you'd need to make a single nuclear weapon. Iran will not have any high-enriched uranium stockpile at all. And Iran's 3 nuclear reactors will only use fuel supplied by other countries as prefabricated fuel loads, and all spent fuel will be removed to another country for reprocessing. So all of this will be continually monitored by more than 100 inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and they will reside in Iran and have facilities at the various nuclear sites. So in these ways, the Iran agreement buys time by blocking all access to plutonium and lengthening the time it takes to obtain 15 kilograms of bomb-grade material to more than 1 year. Now, discussions of nuclear proliferation use the term breakout in a technical way. What it means is the time when a nation has acquired enough material, enough weapons-grade material to build a single bomb. But having the material is not enough. You have to build the bomb, right? And building that bomb is not a trivial task, right? It would take several months at least to build a weapon, even if you had all the material you needed to do so in hand. And the success of that weapon, or that trial test, can only be judged by exploding the device. Right? An explosion is easy to detect even from very far outside Iran. Right? We have a global network of seismic detectors around the world, among other methods. And Iran has agreed not to engage in a variety of activities and technologies which are used in nuclear explosives in their development, but the problem is that these don't have to occur at industrial scale. Right? They're laboratory kinds of things or small facility sorts of things. And so sometimes detecting them can be rather difficult. And so that's why most non-proliferation efforts center on access to the first step, to actually creating the material you need to build the bomb. And the Iran achievement is no different. It does provide for IAEA monitoring and inspections of suspected activities that might be related to bombs, and for monitoring international purchases of related technologies and materials. And next, there's a big difference between a first explosive device and a deployable weapon. A weapon must be light and compact enough to fit on an available delivery system. It must be rugged enough to survive the rigors of delivery, launch on a missile, for example. And it must be reliable enough that a nation can have some reasonable confidence that it'll work. And so designing a reliable and deliverable weapon is far more difficult than simply creating that first explosion. And it requires data and experience which can only be obtained by nuclear testing. So if a nation wishes to use a nuclear weapon as an instrument of coercion, or even just as a credible deterrent, they also have to advertise, right? They must test the weaponized system in a way which is obvious to the world. So in short, the time for Iran to obtain a deployable nuclear capability is the breakout time, then at least several more months to develop a first weapon, and then at least several years more to develop a deployable weapons system. So it's important to recognize that even when people speak of the breakout time becoming small after the treaty expires, it doesn't mean that the militarily feasible weapon can be produced in no time flat. There's a considerable lag that has to occur. And does the agreement prohibit all nuclear activities in Iran? No. It would be illegal to do so, since Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If Iran is willing to cooperate with the International Safeguards Program, there's no reason to do so. If it's not willing, such a prohibition would be impossible to enforce anyway. Does the agreement address the host of other issues which the international community has with Iran? No. It can be argued that addressing these issues will be easier dealing with a non-nuclear Iran than with a nuclear Iran, and perhaps this is what motivated the P5+1 to negotiate the current agreement. But it's very clear, it's a narrow non-proliferation treaty. The Iran agreement, if upheld, does achieve the non-proliferation goals of buying at least another decade to seek other solutions. But it's only a start. Making good use of this time to find such solutions is the difficult task ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you. So given my area of expertise, I'm going to be giving you guys a brief overlook or overview of the negotiation dimension and its complexities. Since I've been fascinated with how the term negotiation has been thrown around most recently, I thought it would be nice to start off with the basic textbook definition of negotiation, and that is it's a means of getting something you want from others. In essence, it is simply a form of communication designed to reach an agreement when two or more actors have some interests that are shared and others that are opposed. Very few actors are willing to accept decisions that are dictated to them by someone else and would rather participate in the decision-making. So more importantly, for an agreement to be signed, each side must have something to gain. Otherwise, why would you sign an agreement? That being said, negotiations are difficult, even more difficult when you have multiple actors who you have to take into consideration not only the preferences of those actors, but the preferences of the constituencies of each of those actors. Before I talk about the specificities of the negotiations, I would briefly like to mention that the world has bought into this agreement, with the exception of 1 or 2 nations. That is, over 100 nations have already backed this agreement and believe that the deal would ensure that Iran's program is peaceful in nature and that it would curb the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. Now, having a debate about this agreement is very healthy and important for our democracy. However, what's more important is having a civil discourse and debate these issues based off merits while being grounded in realistic expectations. The whole world's watching, and our credibility and diplomatic leverage in future negotiations, not just with Iran, but with other actors across a whole slew of different issues, is on the line. Now, before any negotiations occur, whether you're negotiating with your spouse or whether you're negotiating a deal with Iran, each side must determine what its preferences are. In doing this, one must decide what they ultimately want, but they also must decide what they're willing to give up in order to achieve their main goal and preferences. So in essence, in any negotiations, there are always trade-offs that need to be assessed. So what were the preferences or goals for the actors involved in this agreement, and did they achieve it? Now, before we start, we need to set the stage. For those that are not aware, this Iran nuclear agreement that was signed on July 14 was actually the 3rd and supposedly final agreement negotiated between Iran, US, Russia, China, Germany, France, UK, and the representative of the EU, i.e. the representative of the 28 European states. Now, the first agreement that doesn't get much attention was signed on November 24, 2013. Now, in 2012, it was verified that Iran had made technical progress on a number of areas. And according to the intelligence community back then, Iran had the scientific, technical, and industrial capacity to eventually produce nuclear weapons if it desired. This was the reality that the United States administration had found itself when the negotiations began, and that was the starting point of the negotiations. Of course, we would have preferred that was not the case, but we were placed in a difficult situation of what to do next. The US and other nations recognized that the sanctions had not deterred Iran from moving forward on its nuclear capability, and so they needed to do more to ensure the nature of Iran's nuclear program remained peaceful. So when President Rouhani was elected in June 2013 and offered to be more transparent, negotiators realized that this was a great opportunity that should not be missed. So the first agreement that I mentioned, it was called the Joint Plan of Action, laid out the specific steps to be taken by each side. With respect to Iran, they had to first pause further developments to their nuclear program until a final agreement was reached. They had to roll back significant elements like the stockpile of 20% enriched uranium and allow for more extensive IAEA monitoring and access to nuclear site. What you don't hear much about is that Iran, for the next 19 months, that is from November 24, 2013 until they signed the agreement, stuck to its side of the agreement. And then in April this year, they signed the framework. In July, they signed the comprehensive. So walking into the initial negotiations in 2013, we wanted to halt Iran's development until we can get into place an agreement that would monitor and verify the nuclear program. I think part of the confusion that we're hearing and that has emerged is that many politicians have floated the idea that the aim of the negotiations was to dismantle the whole nuclear program rather than to ensure its nature. And as my colleague Phil just mentioned, Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so they have the legal right to develop a peaceful nuclear program. So that goal is not even realistic or possible. Now, in 2003, Iran did approach the United States through the Swiss and offered to halt its nuclear program, which back then was in its infancy, and they didn't really have much centrifuges at that time. They also offered to sever support to Hamas and Hezbollah. But the US administration responded, we don't talk to evil, we defeat it. So fast forward, 10 years later, when the negotiators reached the table, Iran now had the knowledge and the know-how to establish a nuclear program. Now, the goal of ensuring that Iran's program is only for peaceful purpose was the goal of our partners. If we wanted to shift our goal, let's just say, to dismantling the whole program, we might have seen a split in the coalition. This is not a bilateral treaty between Iran and the United States. Now, as for Iran, the main goal entering into the negotiators, as they claimed, was that they wanted the agreement to respect their nuclear rights to develop a program for research and development and industrial enrichment. So at the end of the day, the main aim of the agreement is to deter and to detect any attempt by Iran to pursue a nuclear weapon. It's not in any way meant to remove that program. To ensure this, the US and its allies negotiated a monitoring regime that is extensive, long-term, and multi-layered. Many of the assertions pertaining to the monitoring regime are inaccurate, and honestly, no one has offered a more effective alternative. CIA Director John Brennan has stated that monitoring and verification are as solid as you can get. Ephraim Halvi, former Israeli Mossad chief, stated that Iran has signed, quote, an invasive and unique regime like no other in the world. Now, while no arms control regime can provide a 100% guarantee against covert activity, the current regime increases the likelihood of detection, making breakout an extremely unattractive action or option for Iran. It would be nearly impossible for Iran to recreate its entire supply chain, conversion, enrichment facilities all covertly. In many of the facilities, there will be live technologies that would monitor several sites 24/7. I encourage people to read the agreement for themselves. The negotiators were thorough. They even put in place safeguards that would require Iran to notify the IAEA of design changes as well as nuclear programs or projects. These safeguards and requirements are permanent. They do not expire in 15 years. Thank you.
Good evening. What I would like to talk about is the regional background that has evolved in the Middle East after over the last few years, and to place the agreement within that regional context. Over the last few decades, Iran has emerged as a major Middle Eastern power. And the balance of power between Iran and the Arabs has tended to shift in Iran's favor. This has a lot to do not with Iran's inherent power, but with the inherent weakness of the Arab states that has emerged over the last few decades. The Arab weakness and disarray. And it's against that background that people in the region, Israelis and others, look at the agreement with Iran. There are two issues that people in the region, and I say Israelis and others, are concerned about. That the agreement contains the Iranian program, but as we've heard, and for all the reasons that are perfectly understandable, does not put an end to the Iranian nuclear project. And there are those, of course, who have their fears about what this may hold in store further down the road. The fact that the agreement leads to the undoing of the sanctions regime also puts Iran in a position of, say, greater regional reach and clout as the sanctions regime is lifted, and that is another reason for regional concern. Having said that, one shouldn't exaggerate Iran's power nor its regional influence. It has arrived at a point of regional influence which is unprecedented. Some Arab rulers have referred to what they call the Shiite crescent, stretching from Iran to the Mediterranean, an area of Iranian influence from Iran to Iraq, and from Iraq to Syria, and from Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is indeed unprecedented. But having said that, the Iranians have their limitations too. And these are quite visible in some of the clashes and conflicts that are going on in the Middle East today that involve Iran and its allies or proxies. The war in Syria is not going well for Iran's client, Assad. The war in Yemen, the civil war in Yemen, where the Houthis were backed by Iran, has seen some serious reverses for the allies of Iran, the Houthis, in recent months as well. So if there are these limits to Iranian regional influence, and the balance of power between the United States and Iran is heavily weighted in the favor of the United States, there are those who argue, and they may have some justice to their argument, that the United States could have negotiated a better deal. But the deal is done. And the time has come to end the debate about whether a better deal could have been achieved or not. It is a done deal. The question that Israel and other players in the region who are concerned about Iran, the question that they should ask themselves is what is to be done now? There is a new reality. What do we do about it? Not what do we say about it, but what do we do about it? And what I think should be done is that Israel and the United States should enter into a parallel agreement about what Israel and the United States should do in unison, in cooperation, when and if Iran does not comply. If all the fear about non-compliance is there, what Israel and the United States should be talking about is what do they do when and if. The second component of this strategic understanding ought to be, what do Israel and the United States do about Iranian hegemonic design? What do they do if and when the Iranians use their windfall of sanctions relief to support Hezbollah and other organizations involved in the war with Israel or against US interests? And my last comment, and I will close my remarks with that, Israel's place in the region is changing. The Middle East, in which Israel was isolated versus the rest of the Arabs, is no longer the reality. The deep sectarian division between Sunnis and Shiis, with Iran and the Arabs on two sides of the equation, Israel has Arab allies. Countries in the region that have common cause and common interest with Israel. Therefore, the understanding that I think Israel and the United States should seek to achieve is one that some Arab states may not be party to publicly, but could acquiesce in as a means of stabilizing the region and keeping Iran from having too much of a regional influence as it would be in the eyes of the Israelis and these other Arab players. Thank you.
Well, okay. We'll start with Phil with a quick question, going back to the technical parts of the agreement, and going back to the issue of a concern that Iran may decide to basically go again and do stuff that is not right. Where would you worry that Iran would start doing stuff that is against the treaty that then would move into some issue like we've been discussing, that there would be an action against that? What do you think is the weakest part of the agreement?
I think the agreement is actually pretty strong, and you have to ask yourself, why would Iran have engaged in an unprecedented level of intrusiveness? No sovereign nation has ever allowed itself this level of intrusion, save or under military defeat, right? The only time the IAEA has had this level of access was in Iraq after the first Gulf War. And so that bears remembering in that. That said, again, the nuclear safeguards, the nonproliferation world has a lot of experience in these kinds of matters, and this notion of going after the fuel chain, where you have to build big plants and you do big things that are easily monitored, and the IAEA has a lot of experience, is pretty sound. The parts, if I had to worry about something, I'd worry about clandestine development of technology that could be used for a bomb very quickly. So, for example, trying to actually build a bomb without the one little piece, and then you could very quickly rush after that if you did that. Now, I don't think they actually have the technology to do that very effectively. That's a very hard thing still to do. Maybe, yes, you could make a first bomb, but not a weapon. But I guess if I had to pick those small, more difficult to monitor aspects like developing multi-point detonation systems for the chemical explosives in a bomb, or initiators to produce a pulse of neutrons which actually trigger the chain reaction itself, or things like that you can do in a laboratory, or at least a munitions, small munitions facility would be the places I would look.
Thank you. I would just suggest to all of you, if you want to see, I think, the kind of bomb that Phil is talking about, just go to Pima Air Museum, and they have a facsimile of the first bomb that was made by the U.S., and it's the size of a Volkswagen, so they're hard to make small.
I would like to open it up. We have three people who are recognized as international experts in their field, who in nuclear physics, atomic energy, in diplomacy, and in the Middle East, Asher, who is in the past advised Israeli prime ministers, Jordanian kings. These people are world-class scholars in their field. We had last night a debate on TV. Okay, you knew I was going there. You knew I was going there. Several of the people on that panel said, day one, not several, a couple of them said, day one, my presidency, I ripped this deal in shreds. What happens from each of you in that case? Do you want to be around if they rip that? That's the part I'm worried about from you.
Well, exactly. I think ripping the deal up means there are fewer constraints, fewer checks. Right? As I say, the whole point is to buy time. So you lose that buying of time. You lose a decade. Mm-hmm. You also lose the cooperation of all those people you spent that much time sitting at a table negotiating with, both on your side and on the Iranian side. And what are you going to do then when the rest of the country thinks that you're not reliable? The rest of the world, rather, thinks you're not reliable on both sides? It just doesn't make sense to me. I can understand people who want to make further progress on the whole range of issues that Iran poses for the world, and it's a laudable goal. But this is a baby step. So I wouldn't be so concerned that this would be something I would want to rip up right away, but rather I'd want to forge ahead and, as Asher suggests, follow on and see what we can do in that extra 10 years to make a difference.
Well, there are several things I think we tend to forget. Negotiations happen every single day among states, among actors in this international arena. And what you negotiate in one arena can impact what you negotiate in other arenas, but also it sends signals, credibility, commitment, your reputation. All of these, even right now, the world is looking at us and not understanding the debate that we're having. This is not a bilateral treaty between the United States and Iran. It went through the United Nations Security Council, it was passed, it's done. So let's just assume they rip it, which doesn't really mean that much, but let's just assume they rip it. So what you have done right now is you are no longer part of this agreement. So the only thing you can do is to keep the sanctions that are passed by the United States. For that to happen, you still need the cooperation of the rest of the world, because the sanctions are not a one-way street. And so you need the rest of the world to cooperate. The rest of the world has told us they're not going to cooperate. People tend to forget that the only time the sanctions had an effect was in 2010 when Russia and China signed on, and our European allies were willing to take a big economic hit. And so they're not going to continue. By July 28, the German economic minister was already there. They began to discussing with Iran a 10 billion euro deal. Italian foreign minister has already signed a memorandum of understanding. The French foreign minister has gone. The EU foreign minister has gone. So Swiss has already removed its sanctions. So the world has moved on. We're the only ones still talking about it. And I think that it's interesting that we're not looking at what the world's doing. And so I think the world's going to look at us and say, next time you negotiate with us, your credibility, they're going to up their demands next time, because they're going to ask more from us, because they're going to say, we now no longer trust that you abide by your word.
If I just may add one comment. Iran has committed itself in this agreement twice. Never, ever to acquire or to develop a nuclear weapon.
On page 1.
Therefore, any step that goes against this commitment, which is very general, is non-compliance. If the United States rips up the agreement, what is to hold the Iranians to compliance? How will Iran be held to their commitment if the United States rips up this agreement? So I do not think that that would be a great idea. And I have my doubts if any elected president in the United States would really do that in office. But I think it would be an acceleration of a negative direction in Iran rather than otherwise.
Staying on that theme, this issue has polarized people in so many ways. Two sides, the pro and the con. And each side marshals experts. How is it that we got to a point where, speaking as a person who works in the humanities and social sciences, I would expect the scientists to have been able to agree on this, and yet each side can bring together scientists one way or the other. Diplomatic people the same way, and regional experts. How is it that we're at this impasse where, in this country anyway, we have this kind of polarity in the view of this deal?
I think it's an indication of how the press doesn't always know how to deal with complicated issues. While there are some scientists that are marshaled on the anti-treaty side, they're very few, right? And the press seems to sometimes be excessively committed to making things look balanced, which in fact are not at all balanced. There are very few scientists that understand this stuff, that don't say that this is a strong step at verification. It's not perfect, of course, but it's a strong step at improved verification and in buying time. So I don't think that actually we really are in that situation, technically.
From the science side.
I think diplomatically, I think part of the problem is, as I mentioned, I think they're focusing on different goals, right? So from many perspectives of the people that are marching against it, they're still holding this agreement to an assumption that was never part of the negotiation, and that is dismantling the whole program. So when you're thinking it that way, absolutely, this is a bad agreement and didn't achieve any of that. But what is interesting is that they're not being pushed further by people interviewing them. Well, why did you even think that that was going to be part of the negotiations? People are not pressuring them. Why in 2003, when Iran came and said it gave you everything you wanted, no nuclear program, it didn't have one, a big one, or no centrifuges back then, but it also told you, I will cut off support for Hamas and Hezbollah. And you said, and the United States said no. So what you ended up doing is encouraging Iran to then bring you to the table by increasing or changing the facts on the ground. And so I think that's really, we have just different perceptions of what this agreement was supposed to do. And it was never about dismantling. It's always been about monitoring. And that's the problem. They're never going to agree that that was the original goal.
I'm not an expert on the United States, and I wouldn't want to comment on the polarization in the United States. But just to make an observation, allow me to finish. To make an observation about Israel, not the United States. The debate in Israel is less polarized. The debate in Israel on this issue is less polarized. It is quite related to a realistic analysis. There are the pros and cons, there are the fors and the against. But it is somewhat less ideologically charged than I think it is here. That may surprise some people here, but that is how I understand the debate in my own country.
If I could follow up. And yet, the Israeli Prime Minister comes to the United States, and the American president seems to want to tell Israel what's in its best interests. How do you square that circle?
Well, first of all, there are some realities that we have to come to terms with, we the Israelis. The United States is more powerful than Israel. We are not equals. And therefore, I do not think it's either the place of the United States and certainly not the place of Israel to try and explain to the other what their best interests are. If we look at this in the manner in which most external strategic organizations in Israel at present, external I mean not part of the government, the attitude is a very matter-of-fact one. I think fairly represented in the comment made previously quoting the former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi, which is at variance with the position taken by the Prime Minister. And the debate in Israel is not very heated. There is a very heated discussion between the Prime Minister and the President of the United States. But the debate in Israel is somewhat less heated than I feel it is here. And I think that the more you hear people who come from the Israeli security establishment, the more you hear people who are quite willing to come to terms with what has emerged, not because they trust Iran particularly, but because this is a reality. And let's see how the agreement is implemented. And therefore come to an understanding with the United States about compliance, not about what was, and not about what might have been, but rather to come to an understanding with the United States about how does one follow Iranian compliance. And then what do you do in practice, if and when they don't comply? But that is not an argument which stands against the agreement in and of itself, and accepts the agreement as a fact of life. Good or bad, one can argue, but that's spilt milk. It's now the agreement as a fact of life, which, by the way, in the Israeli scientific establishment, those who have spoken more or less as Professor Pinto has.
Yes.
Very good.
Faten, you've been saying some things here that sort of make me wonder if I want to just push you a little bit more. Okay. You've given a history of Iran's negotiation, and I'm beginning to wonder if you follow that to a logical conclusion that maybe they're not even interested and ever were interested in creating a bomb.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question, right? Because if you want to think back and take a couple of historical events into account, if we go back to 1980 war between Iran and Iraq, right? Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran. And despite the fact that by then you had Ayatollah Khomeini, he refused to authorize chemical weapons because he felt that it was the devil's weapon, and from a religious perspective wouldn't allow it. Even after the war, when some members tried to convince him to go further, he consistently refused to develop. Some say that the current Ayatollah Khamenei in 2004 also issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons. So I don't want to read into whether or not these fatwas are going to be upheld or real, but I think what the Iranians did is textbook negotiation. When in 2003, Khatami tried to negotiate with the United States. People tend to forget. In 2001, when we went to war in Afghanistan, we needed intel on Taliban. Well, who helped us? Iran. And part of the reason why is because they are Iran's enemy and they're their neighbors. So Iran had been keeping a tab on them. And so Iran gave us that information on purpose because they wanted to get a relationship with the United States. And they were trying to show the United States we have a common enemy, and that is Al-Qaeda and Taliban. However, surely thereafter, within a year, they were labeled on the axis of evil. Nonetheless, in 2003, they still attempted to come to us and say, just drop regime change, all right? We'll start behaving well in the Middle East. Remember, so this is still, there's no war in Iraq. The war in Iraq had just started, just drop regime change. That's really what they wanted, is drop this regime change, because by now we were in Iraq, troops in Afghanistan on both sides. And we said no. So from a negotiation perspective, what we teach students or teach people when you're negotiating, what do? If you want to bring the other side to the table, you have to change the facts on the ground, okay? And in essence, to bring them to the table. And the Iranians knew one of the best ways to change the facts on the ground is to develop your nuclear capability, because then they are forced to come to the negotiation table. And so I think that's, again, having just as an outside observer, I think just looking at the textbook, what we teach in the art and science of negotiations, the Iranians played it exactly down to the T of what you need to do.
This deal doesn't it focuses solely on the nuclear issues.
Yes.
It doesn't address any of the regional issues or issues related to hostages. Related to financing of nefarious activities in the region. Was that wise?
That was part of the debate yesterday as well, in terms of issue linkages, right? And we talk about issue linkages in negotiations, and it is important, and sometimes it is actually a good strategy to do to get a better deal. Unfortunately, in this case, again, it was not bilateral negotiations. So for any of these other issues to be put at the table, you needed all the other coalition partners to agree. So you needed China and Russia to agree that these issues should be put at the negotiation table. And it's highly unlikely that they would have agreed. Second, you already had a whole slew of issues that you had to negotiate on. You had to negotiate on multiple site inspections. You had to negotiate on the mines. You had to negotiate on the research and development. And so there's so many issues already to begin with. And as you add more issues, it becomes much more complicated. And a disagreement may fail, not because you don't want an agreement, but it's just too complicated to do that. Another thing, if we really want to bring that up, foreign policy, well, what Iran's going to do, again, this is just me hypothesizing from a negotiation perspective, is then they'll want to put the foreign policy of our allies at the table, right? So then they may bring up issues, for example, like the fact that some of our allies have directly or indirectly given weapons to Al-Qaeda affiliated groups and like-minded groups in Syria. They may bring to the table the issue of Bahrain, which doesn't get much attention here, but the fact of the matter that they also protested, part of the Arab Spring, but the protests were put down, and part of the reason is that we have a Navy Fifth Fleet over there. So it's much more complicated. It's not easy. Yeah, we bring up their issue and it's resolved. And so I think, in essence, it is a good idea to do issue linkages. In this case, there's already too many grievances, too many spilled milk between both sides, that bringing these issues would have deterred us. And I think from the American negotiators' perspective, they recognized that the ensuring the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is a major security or major national security of the United States. And they needed to go after that first before anything else.
I think everyone here, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I just wanted to add that while I don't disagree at all with the whole explanation through the prism of negotiation, but for the Israelis or the Saudis or other players who are concerned about Iran, the fact that this is difficult to negotiate doesn't satisfy them. Yeah. It still leaves them worried and concerned about matters that were not negotiated. Now, they may not have been negotiated for good reason. That doesn't liberate the Israelis or the Saudis from their concerns.
But true, but can I just add the fact of the matter that even the Israeli Prime Minister back a couple years ago agreed with, in combination with the United States and the UK, not to link these issues. So just go back into the media and read what they said. All of them said, let's delink it. So this was a conscious decision made by all parties involved, and probably because they went through these things themselves initially and found it was going to be too complicated. So absolutely, I agree with Asher that it does not satisfy the average maybe citizen, or does not satisfy some of the government officials, but I think that was a reality that we have to live with, that they could not at that point in time. Now what you hope for is in negotiations is that now you build a rapport with the Iranians, that maybe now you can call up and as a favor, why don't you release these hostages? But it doesn't help the level of rhetoric that's happening. And so that is going to complicate any American diplomat now attempting to get those hostages.
I'm not an American, and I don't want to speak for Americans. But I don't think the Americans can ask for the release of their hostages as a favor.
Well, you can actually. Actually, it's done in the past. It's done in the past where you can ask, and it has happened. I'm not saying just as a favor, they're going to give something else up. But what they may give up may be not as important for us. As a result, I think we've had the releases of hostages a couple years ago when they were released. Do you think they weren't released because of back-channeled negotiations, of secret negotiations? They weren't. The Iranians didn't wake up one day and said, here you go, there they are. So what we don't see out in the public doesn't mean it's happening, and it can happen through third parties, and it's happened in the past. So negotiations have been released, they may be released, but I think we also have to remember that, of course, that by creating this enemy image that we are right now, and it's harder to negotiate with an enemy.
Bill?
I just want to comment that Iran is a very important issue, but so is nuclear nonproliferation. We've been worrying about nuclear weapons in the world for a lot longer than we've been worrying about Iran. And in the global sense, it's a bigger issue, right? And I think it's very important not to lose sight of that. This is a non-proliferation treaty, like many that have come before, more detailed perhaps, in more difficult or equally difficult circumstances. But the fewer nuclear weapons we have in the world, the safer we all are.
Very good. I think most people here, students around this campus, watching elsewhere, and the people joining us around the country, really want to ask the question, who wins and who loses? I'd like to rephrase it. What are the positives and negatives on each side? Each side has things that they like in it, they don't like in it. Would you each three address that briefly?
Well, the positives is we've gained 10 years to achieve some kind of a deal for more permanent nuclear disarmament, and a decade is a long time. On the other side, of course, we've freed up on the order of $56 billion of Iran's money, which is frozen, to allow it to do whatever it wants with. And many people would say at least some of that is going to go to nefarious purposes like support of asymmetrical warfare and things like that. So it seems to me those are the two. We have an important nuclear agreement. We haven't done anything else, right? And those are what everybody identifies.
Very good.
I would agree. I mean, from the United States perspective, it achieved its core objective, and that is to ensure that they have an ability to monitor and detect Iran's nuclear program. I think and with the freeing up of the money, I think I want to remind everybody, Iran, in terms of its population, about 52% of Iran's population is between 15 and 40, all right? They're a highly educated population. And there have been a lot of pressures on the government for domestic services, but also the economy. So as much as they love maybe groups in Lebanon and elsewhere, they're going to love themselves first, and they're going to want that money to go first inside of Iran. So I think from Iran's perspective, it told its population, I'm going to get you a deal, and that it's also promised its population to spend the money internally, and they got a nuclear capability. Those were its positives. It's negative, as Phil said, this is the most intrusive, extensive arms control regime ever to exist. And so I think, you know, that's a lot for Iran to give up in terms of sovereignty. For the United States, the costs are also, I think, the domestic polarization. If we're unable to fully commit to this agreement, this makes us look weak. And so we need to be careful how we sell this agreement.
Okay.
Historians speak about late cognition. That is, political actors do not fully understand the consequences of their decisions until a much later phase. Not because of any intellectual failing, but simply because they're human. I think the jury is still out on this one. And the winners and losers will be decided when this agreement is either complied with or not. I think it's very difficult to make a decision on that at this point, but I will say one very, I think, important achievement of the agreement. We're talking about a postponement of 10 or 15 years in different components of the implementation. No military action by Israel or the United States could have achieved a postponement of 10 or 15 years. Maybe 2, maybe 3. And therefore, the fact that this is a real possibility may not be achieved, but is a real possibility, I think is a very positive point that we should not lose sight of. But at the end of the day, implementation and compliance will tell us who won and who lost.
Okay. We have just a couple minutes left. I'd like you each to answer in 20 seconds or less, 30 seconds. What do we do now?
What do we do now? Monitor compliance and start more negotiations for all the other things that we haven't done. And that's I defer to my more technical, my less technical and more important colleagues for the really hard work that has to be done.
Okay.
Again, I think really we need to move forward and start the implementation. This agreement was detailed. They have every step of the process, and so let's just start and see where we go from here. But as Phil and both Asher said, it doesn't mean we stop negotiations, but my advice would be do it in secret, because the public can't handle the negotiations.
As far as I know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming to the United States in November for talks with President Obama. And on the what to do side, I would hope that they have a constructive negotiation about this parallel agreement that I was talking about before, which is not only important for the relationship between Israel and the United States, which needless to say is very important for Israel, but also as a form of deterrence vis-à-vis Iran against violation. The knowledge that the United States and Israel and their Arab allies are agreed upon what it is that should be done, I think that will have a very important impact on the capacity of this agreement to succeed.
Please thank our panelists.
I also wish to thank the three of you. We had a little meeting a few weeks ago in my office, and it's so wonderful to sit down and listen to very bright people discuss a topic properly. I also wish to thank all of you for coming here today. Whenever we put one of these events, we're always delighted that we live in a place like Tucson where our community is so eager to understand and to be educated in all kinds of issues. So again, thank you very much, and good speed. Thank you.